Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Assisting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Clients in Domestic Violence Matters. Thank you for joining us. It's very significant today for us to acknowledge country. Community Legal Centres Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding this presentation, the Turrbal and the Jagera people. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders continue to play in our society. As this presentation is being viewed throughout Queensland, we also pay respect to the traditional owners of the land throughout the country and extend a warm welcome to any First Australians listening to this presentation. We also acknowledge the disproportionately high rates of domestic violence experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the additional challenges this creates in responding to this issue. This webinar is part of a series, Building Capacity in Domestic Violence for Community Legal Centres. It's funded by the Queensland Department of Justice and the Attorney-General through Victim Assist Queensland's Building Capacity program. We would not be able to provide these webinars without that valuable support, and we thank them for it. The topics we discuss in this webinar and others can be confronting and legal information can change. Please take a moment to read the important information on the next screen and visit our Keep Safe website page at any time. At the end of this webinar, there will be time for questions. To ask a question, go to the dashboard on the side of your screen and type it into the box towards the bottom. You can do that at any time, and I'll ask our presenter the questions at the end. Answering those questions will be Angela Carroll, our presenter today. Angela is based in Townsville, where she works as a solicitor with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Legal Services North Queensland at Wallace, North Queensland. She's been working in this area for some time and she's well qualified to give us her insights on this topic, and I welcome her to start speaking to us about it today. Thanks, Angela.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Legal Service is located in Townsville, which is a home of the Wulgurukaba and the Bindal people. We acknowledge the Wulgurukaba and the Bindal traditional owners and all traditional owners past, present and future across the regions whose land we conduct our business, and also to the traditional owners whose land this webinar is being presented on. We would like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the generations, communities and families affected by past government policies and practices. Just checking that everyone can hear me okay as well. If everyone can raise their hands.
Yes, that's fine, Angela. Everyone's talking. Everyone's raising their hand.
Yep, I can see that. That's a relief. So, as Steph said, my name is Angela. I'm a solicitor at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Legal Service. We're a community legal service for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in North Queensland. We have a full-time office in Townsville and a part-time office on Palm Island. Our organisation is run by and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. Our management committee is only has Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women on it. We are the only gendered service for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in Queensland, and domestic violence is present in approximately 85% of all casework. What we offer is on-demand legal advice and full representation, which is up to and including trials in services in family law, child protection, domestic violence, including both aggrieved and respondents, and other civil law matters. So the aim of this webinar is to provide attendees with an understanding of the impact of domestic and family violence on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, to provide attendees with an understanding of the risk factors that result in higher rates of domestic and family violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, to provide attendees with practical tips in assisting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients in domestic and family violence matters, and to provide attendees with culturally appropriate referral pathways to ensure client engagement. I guess the only thing I want to stress at this point is that this webinar, of course, does not replace cultural competency training. This is just some things that have, in my experience, worked in engaging appropriately with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients and communities. as I said, this is not cultural competency training in any way, shape or form. So some of the things we're going to cover in the webinar are statistics, risk factors and relevant issues for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients, practical issues in working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients, some legal issues that may arise, and referral pathways. So I thought we'd start off with a case study and then talk about some things, some issues, and then we'd revisit the case study at the end. So this is just a made-up case study, which is quite typical, I suppose, of a client that we would see at our service. So Samantha is a 23-year-old Aboriginal woman who lives in Deerigan. For those who aren't familiar with Townsville, Deerigan is approximately 20 minutes by car from Townsville City. The buses run every hour to 90 minutes, and that's if they show up. Public transport, unfortunately, is not so great here. Samantha has a daughter, Ellie, who is 5 years old. Samantha grew up on Palm Island and moved from Palm Island to Deerigan 1 year ago. Samantha's grandma was taken from her family when she was a little girl, and her family does not trust the authorities. Samantha has filed an application for a protection order against her ex-boyfriend, John, who she dated for approximately 12 months. Her application alleges that John has bashed her numerous times in front of Ellie, sexually assaulted her, threatened to steal Ellie from her, and has punched holes in the walls of her rental. Samantha has already gone to court, and filing directions were made for Samantha to file and serve her affidavit material in 6 weeks' time. Samantha has no idea what an affidavit is. Her car is broken. It is school holiday, so Ellie is home all day with her, and she only has 1 week left to prepare her affidavit material. All of Samantha's family lives on Palm Island, so she doesn't have any family support in Townsville. Samantha goes on to say her dad just passed away, and she has been on Palm Island for sorry business for the last 2 weeks with no phone reception. Samantha is crying on the phone because she is scared that her application is going to get thrown out and that child safety are going to take Ellie away from her because of John's violence. You're the third organisation she has called because no one can help her in such a short amount of time. Samantha thought all she had to do was go to court and file an application and the order would be made. Your principal solicitor hears you boasting about how crazy work has been, and she sees that you have nothing booked in for the rest of the week. She gives you Samantha's matter with a direction to prepare the affidavit and appear in court for Samantha next week. Your principal solicitor tells you that Samantha was very quiet on the phone and she did not understand the questions that were being asked during the call. So you've got the above summary and an appointment with Samantha scheduled for 9:30 tomorrow. So as I said, we'll revisit that case study at the end. So just for background, I've included some statistics. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are significantly more likely to experience family violence than non-Indigenous people. In the Australian Institute of Family Health and Welfare's report titled Family, Domestic and Sexual Violence in Australia, it was stated that in 2014 to 15, 1 in 7 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experienced physical violence. In 2014 to 15, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women were 32 times as likely to be hospitalised due to family violence as non-Indigenous women, while Indigenous men were 23 times as likely to be hospitalised as non-Indigenous men. In 2015 to 16, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were 7 times as likely to be subject of a substantiated child abuse or neglect notification to child safety as non-Indigenous children, and that is most often the result of domestic and family violence within the home. An interesting statistic that's part of the Carmody report is that approximately 1/3 of female domestic and family violence victims live in a house with children under 5 years old. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients are less likely to use mainstream support services, and I think that's important to state and to acknowledge. There are significant data gaps due to lack of reporting or victims who do not report their cultural identity at all. When I was looking for statistics for this webinar, it was actually quite difficult to find, and the numbers are quite different because of that exact reason. People do not report their cultural identity, or each service, including courts, service providers, things like that, have different ways of reporting, I suppose. So it is very difficult to get proper statistics. It is important to consider the issue of lateral violence. For those who don't know what lateral violence is, it can also be called horizontal violence or intraracial conflict, and it is a result of complex historical, cultural and social dynamics that result in a spectrum of behaviours. That report by the Human Rights Commission is quite interesting, and I've linked to it in the PowerPoint as well. In saying that about lateral violence, there is a misconception that violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people only occur within the community. It really needs to be said that domestic and family violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people also come from non-Indigenous partners and others. It is not just within the community, it is from outside the community too. There is also a fear and a lack of reporting domestic and family violence due to fears of children being removed. Some of the risk factors, they include social stresses such as poor housing and overcrowding in housing, financial difficulties, unemployment, remote living, poor access to services, exposure to violence as a child, removal from family, and poor physical and mental health and disability. The historical issues, which include removal of land, cultural dispossession, and removal of children, have resulted in transgenerational trauma. And there are some reports out there that do suggest that trauma can be genetic, and I think that's important to think about as well. There is a lack of education and understanding of what constitutes domestic and family violence, and there is limited access to support services, and even those that do exist, there is unfortunately long waiting lists for support services. And that information is gotten from that report, which I have linked to at the end as well. So some of the things I'm going to talk about now are cultural competency and cultural safety. Understanding family, things to think about when making appointments, communicating with clients, referral pathways, and collaborating with culturally appropriate support services. So, as I said, this is obviously not a cultural competency webinar. That's certainly not my place to talk about that. But make sure that that your office is culturally safe and welcoming. And a way of doing that is simply having the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags in your reception. That says, hey, we welcome you. It's a good way to show your support and show your appreciation to the community. Have all staff undertake cultural competency training. If possible and appropriate, have an identified staff member present in your office. Consider whether a referral should be made to a legal service specialising in working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and consider your office's ongoing engagement with the local community and with elders. So there's just some preliminary things to have a think about. I just want to touch on the definition of family within the community, because I think that's important, particularly for domestic and family violence matters. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do have a broad definition of family. The family structure reflects cultural views and involve kinship responsibilities that are not typical to non-Indigenous families. So for example, my mum's sister is my mum too. My mum's cousins are my aunties. My grandmother's sister is also my grandmother, and my cousin is my sister. So understanding that family and kin is really important, particularly for domestic and family violence matters, when you consider that relevant relationship element. And when you look at Section 19, subsection 4 of the legislation, the definition of family, relationship and relative does include that cultural groups have a wider concept of family. And the examples in that section specifically include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So someone who I would consider family, also who I wouldn't consider to be family, may be considered family in the Aboriginal culture. It's also important that you understand the definition of family and that broad definition of family, because sometimes the courts will need help to understand. So it's important to have your head around that. So first contact from a client. Clients will often contact you when the client is in a state of crisis, or it may even be a support service on the client's behalf. Unfortunately, that's not uncommon. English may not be a client's first or second language. A lot of clients that we see, particularly if you're based more rural or remote, may actually speak a traditional language as their first language. Clients may give you limited or no details of their legal issues until they see you in person, and they may also be unwilling to give details to reception staff. Something I do touch on a little bit later is that notion of shame. A lot of clients do feel shame about talking about their personal issues with a stranger or with someone that's outside of their family. Be aware of immediate referral pathways for clients during the first contact with your service. Something I do touch on the next slide, I think, is that clients can be difficult to get back in contact with sometimes, and that's because of a wide variety of reasons. So if you have those immediate referral pathways available, it's good to give them to clients during first contact. Clients will often experience shame, as I said, when it comes to their legal problems, seeking help and speaking out about their problems, and that does relate to why clients will often contact you in a state of crisis, because they don't want to talk about it. So when making appointments with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients, as I said before, clients can be difficult to contact, especially when a client lives in a rural, regional, remote or discrete community. And that can also mean they're difficult to stay in contact with. Most common reason is because they don't have reception or internet access. They don't have credit to call you back, things like that. The needs of a client's family and community may have priority to your scheduled appointment or attendance at court. If a client has a family commitment come up, it's more often than not that they're going to give that priority than going to court or coming to an appointment. So it's important to be aware of that and to allow for some flexibility. Transport can be a hindrance to attending appointments, meetings and court, especially when a client is rural, regional, remote, lives in outer suburbs and lives in discrete communities. For example, we do an outreach service on Palm Island. There is a bus on Palm Island. It costs $15. Most clients don't have a car. So to come into court by 9 o'clock, some clients have to walk 1 to 2 hours just to get to court from the other side of the island. So it's definitely something you need to consider and you need to think about. So when you're booking appointments for clients, consider allowing extra time or making longer appointments. So that way, if, for example, a client's got to catch a bus and the bus is late, you've got that extra time and you've allowed for it. Try to allow for flexibility and be available on demand. Remind clients of their appointment or of their court date the day before, and really stress how important it is that they attend those dates. And consider whether the client has the ability to actually attend the appointment. There's no point scheduling an appointment that's face-to-face if a client has no capacity to attend. So in that respect, consider whether you could perhaps conduct a phone appointment. Getting instructions from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients. Pay attention to the client's body language and their eye contact. Some clients won't make eye contact with you, and that comes back to that shame. For example, if I've got a client who's turning her body away from me, she's not looking me in the eye, and she's talking really quietly, I'm going to essentially mirror what she's doing. I'm not going to get close to her. I'm not going to force her to look me in the eye. I'm not going to speak loudly at her. I tend to speak quietly and match her level. I don't force her to look me in the eye. Be aware that clients may say yes or say they understand something when they do not. Be aware of a client's feelings of shame and embarrassment in speaking about their legal matters, particularly in domestic and family violence matters. Clients may not wish to discuss their personal matters with the opposite gender, especially in domestic violence. So everyone's heard of men's business and women's business. So if you have a woman come to you, see if there is a woman solicitor available, and same goes for men. You know, that's not always the case. We actually had a male work with us for 6 months, and it was actually quite rare that women wouldn't talk to him, but we always made sure we gave women the choice, that if they didn't want to talk to a male, that was okay. Make it clear what work you have agreed to do for a client, what you have not agreed to do. It's really important to manage expectations, which goes for all clients that we see in a CLC. Many clients will want to bring a support person with them, which is usually someone from their family. This is great because it does help a client feel more comfortable, but of course in domestic violence matters, it may not actually be appropriate to have a family member who's also related to the other party sit in, so approach with caution. Let the client tell their story without interruption. This is something I personally prefer to do, especially on a first meeting, because clients come in, they just want to sit down, they want to tell you everything, and I find that if I don't interrupt them during that first 15 or so minutes, clients tend to tell me more information. And avoid asking yes and no questions. So try to ask open-ended questions, and that comes back to clients may just continue saying yes even if they mean no or they mean something else. So some of the things that we found works at our service is we take a bit of extra time to establish a rapport. So particularly if a client is nervous or anxious or a bit embarrassed to be there, I will sit down for 10 minutes and say, oh, so who's your family? Where are you from? Where's your family from? Tell me about your kids, things like that. Consider whether the support person present is actually a suitable support person. That goes back to that meaning of family as well. Make sure they're not actually related to the other party somehow, or they're not going to go off and tell the other party what's going on. Consider whether there are any culturally appropriate support services that can assist your client. For example, with transport, attending counselling, making and keeping appointments, things like that. So in Townsville, we have the Townsville Aboriginal and Islander Health Service, which offers client support services, which will help with clients with transport. So that's a big help for us to get around that transport issue in Townsville. So revisiting Samantha's case study, what are some of the issues that arise from the case study? And when you're preparing for your appointment with Samantha, what sort of things should you think about?
If you want to type anything into the box on your screen, I will relay that to Angela. Nothing coming through so far. What would be your first thought about Samantha, Angela?
So my first thoughts would be obviously the trauma from domestic violence and intergenerational trauma from past government practices. She is the descendant of someone who was part of the stolen generation, and she has also experienced trauma from domestic violence, and not to mention her father's just passed away. So those would probably be my first thoughts. And as I said, she's just experienced trauma and grief from the recent loss of her father. Samantha's going to be scattered, and the funeral may not have even been held yet, so she could still be very heightened and upset. So Samantha's from Palm Island. For those who aren't familiar with Palm Island, funerals tend to be held on Fridays on Palm Island. The community shuts down and the focus is on grieving and saying goodbye to that person. So if there's been a number of deaths in a short amount of time, it can take quite some time for a funeral to be held. Past government practices have led to a distrust in government agencies. So Samantha probably doesn't have a lot of trust for police. She's nervous about child safety taking her daughter away because of domestic violence. Sometimes when clients come in and see me, they think that I work for the government, so I spend some time making it clear that I don't work for the government. So I think it's important to be aware of that as well and make it really clear that, you know, you're a lawyer, you have a duty of confidentiality and you have a duty to the client.
Some practical things that people have come up with. Oh, sorry, Angela. Some practical things that people have come up with as things that they would consider issues of safety planning or lack thereof. Offering a cab charge or seeing if another service can help with transport, so that can be offered for her. Somebody else says that in working in this area, they noticed that it was easier for them to break down barriers if they came from a different area entirely as a non-Indigenous woman speaking to an Indigenous woman. And
absolutely.
it's an important issue for lawyers to be aware of when they have support people with them. So I don't know whether you agree with those points.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're really great points. And particularly that point about, you know, for clients finding it easier to speak with someone that's not from the area at all. I think that is a really important point to make. So I said earlier that if you can have an identified person present, that may be suitable, but there are certain circumstances where it's not suitable or appropriate. Clients may actually not open up if you have an identified person there. And certainly in our office, because we are quite a small community, if a client knows our receptionist, for example, sometimes they do feel a bit nervous about coming in. I guess the way around that is to assure them that everything is confidential. And I offer to refer them somewhere else if they would feel more comfortable with that. So yeah, I think that is a really good point and a really important point to make. So other things include, if it's more appropriate, it may be more appropriate to book Samantha in to see a woman, particularly given that she's experienced sexual assault. Samantha may be late and she does have to bring Ellie with her. So she's told you that she has to catch the bus from Dirrigan, which is 20 minutes away, and the buses are an hour and 90 minutes apart. And she's got to bring her daughter because it's school holidays. So consider what arrangements you can make. If you've got toys, colouring in activities, things like that. Erica, our receptionist, does print out colouring in sheets for the kids and they seem to really enjoy it. Samantha has probably not disclosed the full extent of the violence against her, and she may not realise that some of the things that happened do amount to domestic violence. Have a list of relevant culturally appropriate referrals for Samantha for when she comes in, and check if she needs help to contact them. I will often contact support services, and with her permission, of course, and see if they can get in contact with her and give her assistance, whether that be with counselling, wellbeing, that sort of thing. Pay attention to Samantha's body language and eye contact during the appointment. Consider whether there are any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff available to sit in to make Samantha feel more comfortable. As we've just talked about, that may not be appropriate. Sort of gauge, see if you can gauge where Samantha's at, give her the option. If she says no, that's fine. If she says yes, that's great as well. Use plain language and continually assess Samantha's understanding of your advice. And consider whether an adjournment is needed to complete the affidavit material, having consideration to Samantha's grief and trauma. No matter what you do, you may just need to get an adjournment. She's had a lot go on. So I just wanted to touch on assisting respondents. I know a question came in beforehand about assisting respondents. Of course, all the previous points made are applicable to working with respondents. Allow the client the opportunity to give their story and ask for the history of the relationship to ascertain the whole story. Something we do unfortunately see is women who have been discriminated against. So consider whether your client has been discriminated against. For example, have police made a decision that your client is a respondent based on racial considerations? Consider referring your client to a culturally appropriate men's or women's group. So for example, in Townsville, we have the Uncle Alfred's men's group and Healing Waters Yarning Circle for women. They're both really great because they are culturally specific, they are culturally appropriate, and they are gender specific groups, and they do address domestic violence issues predominantly as well. Working with rural, regional and remote clients, as I said, we have an office on Palm Island. We have a part-time office and a worker who lives on Palm Island, and we also do an outreach duty lawyer service on Palm Island as well. So working with rural, regional and remote clients, there is greater difficulty in communicating with clients due to longer postage times, limited or no telephone reception or access, and limited to no internet access. So on Palm Island, even though it's fairly close distance-wise to Townsville, it takes about a month for a letter to get to Palm Island. There are a lot of areas on Palm Island that don't have telephone reception, and they only have Telstra on Palm Island. They don't have Optus or anything else. Not a lot of people on Palm have internet either. So you've really got to be mindful of that when you're assisting a client who may live in a discrete community or a rural community. There's also difficulty in seeking support due to lack of available services, long waiting periods, or family members or friends of clients or the other party that work at those services. There's also difficulty in attending court and appointments due to limited transport and limited means of travel, which I talked about a bit earlier with Palm Island, the bus being $15, and it being, you know, for a lot of people, more than an hour's walk just to get to court. So it's really important to have those things in mind when you're assisting clients in rural, regional and remote areas. So just to summarise, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience domestic and family violence at a significantly higher rate than non-Indigenous Australians. It's important to be considerate of clients' cultural needs right from the first contact. If you can build a positive rapport with your client, it will ensure success in the client's engagement. Be aware of the specific challenges that are faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients and the reasons why these challenges remain prevalent today, and have consideration to culturally appropriate referrals, whether that be counselling, men's groups, women's groups, yarning circles. As I said, in Townsville we've got TARS, which is fantastic, and I think my understanding is, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but there are similar services that are based in most capital cities in Queensland as well. That's just some of the resources that are used in putting this together. The Family Wellbeing Services down the bottom has a list of those culturally specific support services across Queensland. So I think they're great in engaging clients with, because it really does help with those practical things, and it helps with continued engagement. So that's it from me. Are there any questions?
Questions come in, Angela. One attendee has noted that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients don't tend to use the family court system. I'm not sure whether the same would be true of the domestic violence court system in the magistrates court, and notes having come across a very small number within that system. Have you given us, do you think, some of the explanation for that when you've talked about the background to these issues? Or is there something else that you can help us to understand why that might be?
I think a lot of that comes from, you know, those past issues within government policy. And I'm certainly keen to hear anyone else's thoughts as well. Clients don't tend to trust police, in my experience at least. So for domestic violence matters, when you're talking about, okay, let's go to court, let's get a domestic violence order, let's deal with this, a lot of clients will say to me, why bother, the police won't do anything anyway. And, you know, clients have experienced a a lifetime of discrimination based on their race, and I think that has a lot to do with it as well. I guess in terms, I haven't had the experience of clients not engaging with the Magistrates Court in any other respect, other than feeling that it won't help their situation. But I think, as I said, it comes more from a place of they don't trust that anything will happen, which I think is really sad and really unfortunate. And that's what I would think about the family courts as well. I'm not sure if that really answers the question.
Thank you for that. If anybody else has a question, you can type it into the dashboard and I'll pass it on to Angela. We've had a couple of questions, perhaps not in your direct area of expertise, but asking about how, as a legal advisor to perpetrators, you can work to ensure victim safety and still hold a respondent to account.
I think what's important in working with respondents is educating respondents on what domestic violence is. So explaining what the meaning of domestic violence is, in that it's not just physical abuse, it's verbal abuse, it's intimidation, it's threats, it's all those behaviours. And of course it's going to depend on the client at the end of the day, but sometimes explaining what domestic violence is will help educate them and will help, I guess, start addressing some of those behaviours. And I certainly do think that it's important to refer clients, and including respondents, to counselling services, to intervention groups, things like that. As I said, in Townsville, we've got the Uncle Alfred's men's group and the Healing Waters women's group. They're both really great because they do address, both kinds of behaviours. So I think those culturally appropriate referral pathways will assist in dealing with that behaviour as well.
Another question, perhaps more geared to another service, but perhaps you can speak to your experience of other services, is about the best approach to engage, particularly with Indigenous men who use violence. Would it be a different approach than you might use with other men using violence?
I think for Indigenous men who are using violence, I think, again, a lot of it comes to that culturally appropriate referral. I think if in Townsville, for example, we have up at the DV court as well, we have cultural support workers up at the court on court days, and there is a man there as well who does talk to the Indigenous men, and he does talk with them about their behaviour. He does help refer them. As I said, I work for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Legal Service, so I work with women. But what I have seen other service providers do is, referring men to intervention groups and to culturally specific intervention groups, which I think really is the best way forward.
We'll be trying to put together a webinar specifically on dealing with respondents later in this series of webinars, and that might draw out some more expertise on those points. On a practical level, somebody else has asked whether you link your clients with housing services. Is that an important part of what you do, or is it a referral?
So we do assist clients with linking in with housing services. We do primarily, when a client has a tenancy issue, we do primarily tend to refer clients to Q-Stars Tenants Queensland. However, in saying that, sometimes we do consider it to be more appropriate to stay with us if we're dealing with a domestic violence matter. So we will assist clients with tenancy matters. And I think if possible and appropriate, it is good to do that. We also assist clients with their housing applications and with writing support letters to try to bump them up the list, particularly in domestic violence matters. I think doing those non-legal support referrals is really important for Indigenous clients as well.
And this might be something that we can provide some extra resources for when we put this recording and PowerPoint up on our website. But a question has come in about the Mandel model, safe and together. Mandel, for those listening in, is spelled M-A-N-D-E-L-L. And asking about what your opinion is in regards to working that with, inverted commas, our mob, close inverted commas.
I have to be honest, I have not heard a whole lot about the Mandel model, and that worries me, and I feel a bit embarrassed to admit that. But it is something I am really interested to know more about, and I will be looking into. So I'm sorry I can't really answer that question.
No, I think that might be something we need to delve into a little bit deeper and give people some links and things to follow up themselves. And we will be putting anything like that comes out of today's webinar up on our website. This recording will be available probably later in the week at this point. The recorded webinar and the PowerPoint will be up on our webinar. We are evaluating these webinars so that we can best meet your needs, and you should see a little survey pop up at the end of the webinar. Please complete that if you can, so it helps us to provide the best possible education services for you. Thanks very much, Angela. We've had a great response to today's webinar, and I'm giving this vote of thanks on behalf of everyone attending today, and it's been very informative. And if anyone has missed it or their colleagues have missed it, or you want to listen to it again, look out for it on our website shortly. But otherwise, if there's no further questions coming in, I'll say goodbye and we'll close the webinar now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nothing else has come in. Good afternoon, everybody.